What's going on, Audioholics? This is Tyler from Audioholics Anonymous here today with my third episode of Getting into Prog. Today, I present the fantastical King Crimson. Now, obviously, I have heard In the Court of the Crimson King a few times in the past, but I never really listened to it all that closely. This week, I gave both albums at least 3 listens, and I really absorbed the music as best I could. Before we start, I'm just going to say that In the Court of the Crimson King is a long fucking title, and so for the rest of the video, I will refer to it as the debut album of the band. Without further ado, let's get into my general thoughts about the debut. Alright, so this is an album that, as I said in the intro, I have actually heard before. I mean, who hasn't? That said, giving this a closer listen really helped me appreciate the showing of pure musicianship that this album turned out to be. I really ended up loving this album. Allow me to explain why I loved it, though, by going through the amazing tracks on this record. So, the album opens with the fantastic song 21st Century Schizoid Man. This is obviously a classic track for a reason. Awesome use of jazz influence and really catchy instrumentals. It just hypes me up so much every time I hear that saxophone flare up in the track's intro. The vocal effects are really not to my liking entirely, but they do serve the song well enough so I don't mind it, and the actual chorus is just awesome. The pure musicality displayed on this track, hell, this album as a whole, is just awe-inspiring. I dig this fantastic track a lot. One of my favorites off this album. And I think it speaks to the pure quality of this album that this isn't my favorite song. Alright, so the second song, I Talk to the Wind. This song is an incredibly pleasant and serene experience. It has a very nice, clear feeling of melancholy to it. It also has some really cool woodwind instruments in the forefront. Not much else to say except that there is an amazing flute solo. I am a fan of this song, but it is probably the weakest one on here. Still, it is masterful. That leads us to Epitaph, and I really love this song. It starts with some really nice instrumentals, huge use of the ever-pleasant mellotron on this album, and it shines on this track especially. The whole song is really cool instrumentally, but I love the vocals on this track in particular. Probably my favorite vocal performance from the entire, not just this album, but either album that I'm covering today. Really gripping melodies, very, very catchy. I could see myself humming this song in the shower, and that's not something I can say about a lot of prog acts. I love it. Alright, and then that leads us into Moonchild, which is an incredibly experimental song. This song starts with something that sounds more akin to the last few tracks, and that is nice, but then it transitions into some extremely experimental stuff, and we'll hear more of that type of thing on the next album that I'm going to cover. And on this track, it's a very spacious sort of improv jam happening on the record. It's really cool to listen to. And the song leads smoothly into the last track in such a fantastic way. The Court of the Crimson King, which is my personal favorite song on the album by far. It's catchy, it's proggy, it's experimental, it's just great. I don't know what else to say about it, except that it's just a fantastic song. Super memorable stuff here. I love the melodies, I love the chorus, I love the vocals and the way that they soar, I love the instrumentals below it, I love everything about this song. And it turns out to be a nigh perfect closer to the album, which is something I'm going to complain about on the next one, is that I don't think it has a good opener or a good closer. But I'll get to that. So, my final thoughts on the album. Well, this is an album that was way ahead of its time. Certainly one of the most influential albums of all time. I don't think anyone can argue that. I will start by saying that the cover art on this album may be what I consider to be the best ever made. It is, of course, the Schizoid Man. at least in the top 3 best album covers. I mean, just look at it. You've been looking at it this entire time I've been talking about this album. That is just a fantastic... I don't know if it's a painting or a drawing, but whatever it is, it's amazing. Really love the instrumental variety in this record musically. Gentle Giant went way further with this, but that doesn't really take anything away from this band. This album has a ton of influences, has elements of blues, jazz, classical, and symphonic genres. It really stands out for a number of reasons. I've already mentioned the great instrumentals, but I really want to draw attention to the percussion in this album. Michael Giles stood out so much when listening to this album. The drumming is just fantastic, some of the best I have ever heard. Amazing fills. Robert Fripp also deserves special mentioning, as he did a fantastic job with the guitars on this record, and of course, songwriting. He was a big songwriter with this album, and all of the King Crimson albums for that matter, and I think he is at least from what I've heard, his peak in this album. You know, one of the things that makes this album amazing is that you can listen to every song on the album by themselves, but the true magic is in listening to it all together, as it flows so perfectly. I think the reason this is so amazing to me is because on most albums it is one or the other. Either it flows really well, or the tracks work on their own without the context of the rest of the album. This record succeeds in both categories, and that is true praise. Being completely frank, I think this is the best album that I have covered so far on this show, and I will go as far as to say that it will be at least one of the best that I will cover on this show in the future. I'm confident of that. I give this album a pure 10 out of 10, not just because it is now one of my favorite albums of all time, but because it stands as one of the absolute best records ever made. It is pure musical bliss. If you are a fan of music, then this is an album that you need to hear at least once before you die. I'm not saying you're going to like it as much as me, but you will respect it. This album will make you respect it. All right, now let's move on to Red. All right. I'm just going to warn you immediately, I did not like this album anywhere near as much as Debut. That's not to say it's bad. I still find it to be a great album, but it has major, major flaws that we will have to get into later. For now, let's just get into the tracks. So the album actually opens with a drawn-out instrumental in the form of the title track, Red. Now, it's a pretty cool instrumental. It has some really interesting riffs. It's heavier than pretty much anything on Debut. Reminds me a lot of something you'd hear off of like a Dream Theater album. I really love the eerie sound that starts up around the 2-minute and 50-second mark. This song does get you hyped up for the rest of the album, and it serves as at least a good intro for that reason, but it does get a little repetitive and it drags a lot. I would not listen to it outside of the record, but I dig it enough. So next is Fallen Angel, which is a really pleasant song. It has some really gripping melodies. I would compare it to Epitaph. I can see myself humming this one in the shower. I would say that I prefer Epitaph as a song, but I really love the verse melody in this one. Super catchy. And this is going to be my favorite song on the album as well. Next, we have One More Red Nightmare, which is really good. I dig the sound of this album as a whole, and this is a really good example of it. It is very different from the Debut, much heavier, much creepier, much darker, but it definitely works in its own way. I love it. Next, we have Providence, which is super, super experimental and creepy. It sounds like something you would hear in a really good horror movie. I like it a lot, but I don't know if I really wanted another long-ass instrumental track after Red. As much as I really find this cool, it contributes to a problem that I'll talk about in my final thoughts a little bit further. This album just doesn't have a whole lot of content. It's lacking severely in substance. Finally, we have Starless, the last song on the album. And this was a cool song. It started out more like Fallen Angel, but really built into some nice, creepy, experimental stuff like Providence. It's pretty good. I wouldn't say it's a good closer, though, because the album just kind of ends. And that can work, but I really don't think it did here. So let's go ahead and get into my final thoughts on this album as a whole. This album is much more dark and eerie than In the Court of the Crimson King was. I wouldn't say that fact makes it better or worse than the debut album. It just makes it sound different. What I will say is that this album has a lot more to criticize than the debut, but let's talk positives first. As I said, this album is much more dark and eerie sounding. Definitely shows off the more experimental side of the band, whereas the debut only really had Moonchild in that department, and I do love that about this album. Also, I think the melodies are far better here. Much more gripping for me as a whole than the melodies on debut. That said, let's go ahead and get into the negatives. For one, oh my god, that album art is terrible. Like, what were they thinking? To go from something like this, which is just fantastic, to this? Just the band members standing in darkness? What the hell were they thinking with this? Oh, it's terrible. And sonically, the album just does not flow well at all. The track listing is a real misfire, in my opinion. I think the album would have been so much better if Fallen Angel led into Starless and then Providence, and then the album closed out with One More Nightmare. I think that there needed to be some transitions added in there to make that work, and also One More Nightmare should have a more fitting ending, since it would be the closer in this proposed track listing. But I think it would flow much better than this album flows, which I don't think it flows well at all. I think that the title track is a cool instrumental, but I wish there was a great opener like 21st Century Schizoid Man. And, like, there just isn't. There's nothing here to open the album up with a bang, and there's nothing here that compares. The track does get you hyped to listen to the rest of the album, which makes it at least a serviceable opener, but there is a lot holding it back from being great. And Starless does not work at all as a closer, in my opinion. I think both of those songs are symbolic of this album as a whole. There is just not a lot of substance here. You have the instrumental Red, which drags. It probably could have been cut straight in half. Fallen Angel's really good. One More Nightmare's really good. Providence is really experimental. I don't think I said this in the small review of the album, but I would say it kind of drags a little also. It probably could have ended sooner. You could have probably chopped a lot of this off and put it at the end of Starless, because Starless has its own little creepy experimental section at the end. I think that these songs just aren't... There's just not enough content here. I mean, what we have is really good, but it's just missing so much. It feels like there are songs that were cut that should have stayed, and I know I don't usually say that, but you have Red, which is what band opens an album with a nigh 7-minute long instrumental? I mean, it doesn't even introduce themes that you'll hear later on down in the album, like something like Overture does in Scenes of a Memory. Like, it's just... This album is just really flawed. So given these criticisms, what would I rate this album? Well, I can't really say this is an album I love. There are a lot of aspects to it I do love, but there is a lot I don't. It is a great album, but it is far from a masterpiece, though I would say it is worth a listen. I would give this album an 8 out of 10. So there you have it. As always, I will ask myself a couple questions before I end the video. 1. Did listening to these albums make me a fan? Well, yeah, I would love to listen to the rest of the discography of this band. At the very least, it is all probably interesting music, if not great music. 2. Did this help me get into prog, and would I recommend them to someone starting out in the genre? Well, half and half. As far as the debut is concerned, hell fucking yes. More so than any other album I have covered so far. But Red? No. It is great, but it is not something I would recommend to start out with. It does not work as well at all than almost any other album I have covered on this show. I think it is actually the worst album I've covered on the show so far. All right, that does it for this week of Getting into Prog, and next week I will be covering a band I know absolutely nothing about, Camel. The albums I will be listening to are Mirage and Moonmadness. I hope to see you then. See you next week. Bye-bye.